Cerebro is busted, the economy is good, the world is upside down on this edition of Marvel Snap Hot Takes. Seasonal keywords don't work with Snap, and Horde is going to be left to die. Zombie Scarlet Witch should have been high Evo style and infected/converted select cards in your deck, so the mechanic came as a package to future-proof it better. I think this is half true and half not. I think that this is baseline the kind of thing that strikes people as true when you're looking at, oh, well, this deck probably isn't getting any more support. But just because a deck doesn't get any more explicit support doesn't mean that things that go in that deck won't get better or worse with differing improvements over the near future. And I think Zombie Scarlet Witch is a great example of this because Zombie Scarlet Witch at baseline is not going to get better. They aren't going to be making more Horde cards to make Zombie Scarlet Witch and Zombie Giant Man better. But they probably are going to be making more cheap skills, which makes that deck a lot better. Because what Zombie Scarlet Witch has done is establish herself as the primary receptacle or synergy piece with cheap skills that you want to get extra value out of. And I think that that is what sets her apart from something like Elsa Bloodstone. That is what sets her apart from other things in her space, is that she's the one that works with skills rather than just units on the board. And that is a space that they will actually be giving stuff to. Now, to dive into the basic premise here, though, which is that Zombie Scarlet Witch, in order to future-proof it, should have been like high Evo, I think that doesn't make a bunch of sense either, because high Evo kind of sucks. And it also, it's tied into, all of this stuff that's very mid. High Evo is a sort of fusion split card between an Afflict card and a Skip Energy card. And that's awesome. It's one of my favorite cards in the game. It's not good. And I think that if they want Horde stuff to stay relevant, what they have to do is roughly what they did. Give it an identity and a place that it hooks into that isn't Horde related. For example, there's a data mine card called Deafening Chord, which does -1 to a unit that your opponent has that costs 3 or less and gets rid of its text. That card is a buff to the zombie package because it is really good with Zombie Scarlet Witch. I don't think that it hooking into more things would have been relevant if those things weren't good. High Evolutionary hooks into a ton of stuff, but it's not in the best Afflict decks, and it's not in the best Energy Skip decks. So it's sort of in between hooking into all this stuff while actually doing none of it. I don't think this stuff is as DOA as it would have been if it came out weak. It is currently in a spot where there is a reasonable thing for me to look at and say, here is what this deck wants in the future. It wants cheap skills. It wants to be that deck that synergizes with cheap skills that allows you to just do a bunch of cool, unique, small ball stuff. And that's what Zombie Scarlet Witch has that is unique to Zombie Scarlet Witch. And that's really what a card needs to be future-proofable, is a role at something that it is the best at. I would feel more confident that, barring any changes, Zombie Scarlet Witch shows up more than High Evolutionary going into the future. Despite High Evolutionary having technically more cards in the package, it doesn't do anything the best. It does a bunch of things the midst. At least Zombie Scarlet Witch has a chance at being, I am a small package, bunch of points, spells that come out make my deck better. That is believable to me as the kind of thing that will exist. It's not necessarily a big space to occupy. It's not occupying a broad space the way High Evolutionary is. But I think there's an argument for giving that kind of card a role at the top. This is going to be the best thing to do with your cheap spells. Werewolf by Night comes to mind. It's basically the card that goes in your Werewolf Merlin deck at this point. That's a good thing to be. Now, will it stay that way? I don't know. Maybe it gets power crept. Its position is definitely precarious, but just giving it more breadth probably wouldn't make that position any less precarious. Cerebro needs an adjustment. Playing against C2 or C3 is the worst feeling in the meta. It's a Hela-like experience that encourages T6 retreats. The only relevant pieces of interaction are extremely archetype specific and absolutely destroy Cerebro. There is no nuance to be had. Yeah, I mean, that's basically how I feel about Cerebro. I don't know that this is even a hot take to me. I think this is like consensus opinion among good players of the game that Cerebro is like outlier strong. It's not fun to play against, and it's really, really good. So if you are someone who is like low rank, Cerebro is gonna really beat people up. That's definitely gonna happen. It is like it is a hella like experience. It is just like, oh well, I don't really have a way to stop you from doing this. Maybe I can Cosmo your Mystique. Maybe I can hope you don't draw it, but none of it is like a Stardust versus Hela level of actually stopping you, except Red Skull, which is run only in one deck, and that one deck occasionally gets rid of it. The unique thing about Cerebro is it gets much, much worse in open deck lists, because the best card against it, Red Skull, is occasionally having its ability removed on ladder, whereas in open deck lists, like in a tournament like Golden Gauntlet, for example, it is no longer having that ability removed and represents I instantly win the game. I think that Cerebro is a very powerful deck that is very underplayed and is very, very bad for the game and should probably get dealt with at some point. And as I guess further evidence for this, I even saw Dexter tweeting, okay, it's fine, they can nerf Cerebro now. And when you have lost Dexter, I fear you have lost the Cerebro constituency. But I don't know if this kind of knowledge has actually trickled down to everybody. So I guess I'm just saying it out loud right now. The bro is kind of messed up. From the perspectives of both meta and economy, Marvel Snap is in a better place now than this time last year. I would say yes, but it's precarious. And from the perspective of like player relations, I would say the answer to that is almost certainly no. And you can talk about a bunch of different reasons for that, but largely I think that while the underlying nature of the economy and the metagame is better now than it was a year ago, that is not buying the goodwill that you might expect it to buy. It is starting to become clear, I think, that people's complaints will happen regardless of whether or not something is better until it is actually the thing that they want. And so, you know, a 10% improvement, let's call it, let's ballpark it, is not perceptible to more than 10% of people, because for everybody else, it's kind of been exactly the same. And so it's not also the kind of stuff that gets people out there, like actually vocally talking about it, right? Like, this was a little bit better for me than it was a year ago. That's not really the kind of thing you notice. The kind of thing you notice is when things get worse time over time. I think also that it's hard to talk about this stuff without talking about Kid Omega, which I think was a pretty big turning point in the relationship between Second Dinner and the community. And it's hard to look at that as anything but, like, yeah, it's been better since then. But the fact that that's even happened in this year as opposed to last year is sort of the kind of thing that makes people scared for the future, and I don't think that's wrong. And this is a great example. The amount of cards released each month with the pack system is great, but the amount attached we get resources to obtain said packs went mostly unadjusted, and now getting cards feels pricier and riskier, even though they're the same price as before. So from all the math I've seen, basically what this person is referring to is the moment they switched over to snap packs, but before they started making more cards. And I'm not sure that's like a really fair way to look at an economy, right? Like, the way they do economy is they have like target X here. And they're like, we want to hit target X in terms of how much people spend. So what we're going to do is explore different ways of getting to that point, right? The previous way was like very heavy on FOMO and relied pretty heavily on making sure that people felt like they had to go buy stuff. And I think it's objectively good that people don't feel that right now. What I think is that the current economic system in Marvel Snap is probably a change that lost them money and didn't buy them goodwill. And this is sort of what I was getting at with the previous, right? Like, I would not be surprised if that the ultimate end result of this current iteration of Snap Packs is that they were like, man, that other system that we had was pretty good. I see stuff like Kid Omega as sort of a symptom of that, right? Like, they're clearly trying to figure out, like, all right, well, if we're releasing all these cards, right, how are we going to get people to pay for them? Because if we're not getting people to pay for them, what is the point of releasing these cards in the first place? Because it feels like the pitch for snap packs was, we'll make it easier to get cards, but we're going to make more cards, so that way you're at roughly the same place that you were, but you have more options to spend your stuff on. You're going to be able to go get your stuff, more importantly, earlier in the game. And I think that that's actually something that has happened, right? If you are a returning player or a new player, you're vastly better off now than you were a year ago. That is true. But it doesn't mean that you're in a good spot. It just means that you're in a better spot. And that kind of brings us back to the previous discussion we were having, because I see these two as pretty related. Largely, my thought process is that the game got a little bit cheaper to be a part of at a metagame level. But it also asked more of you in terms of discipline and understanding and whether or not you need this card. And what that does is, at least in my community, is make people just not buy cards. They're like, I'm not going to buy this card if it's not super busted. I'm going to save for the next time they make a super busted card. And I kind of wonder if that's not a bad outcome for everybody involved. If the players feel like it's still not helping them and they're also not buying stuff, it's very odd, I think. Like, I consider that like a fairly reasonable warning flag. The matchmaking can place you on its own against an opponent who has a counter deck. So I think this is basically BS, because I think it would be a little too hard and too pointless to try to do. The example I always like to use is Enchantress, right? Like, it's like, oh, well, it sees I'm playing an ongoing deck, and so it puts me against someone with Enchantress. But not all ongoing cards are actually weak to the card Enchantress. If I'm playing a Cerebro deck, it's not going to put me against Enchantress, because that's not a good card against Enchantress. If I'm playing like a deck with Devil Dinosaur and Electro, is it going to put me against Enchantress? Like, it doesn't know the difference, doesn't know the text. And if it knows the text, how much understanding of a metagame does it have? Does it know that, for example, Cerebro is a counter deck to whatever mid-range pile you're playing? Does it know that? I think basically designing such a system would require a level of computer that is becoming more and more possible, I suspect, but not necessarily one that exists in the capacity that Second Dinner, an independent game studio, could come up with. I'm not saying they wouldn't do it if they could. I'm saying it's way more work than what it's worth. And the reason for that is, I think that the current matchmaking system does that anyway. Like, the fact is, when you have a matchmaking system that is based on your skill rating, how good the game thinks you are, that matches you up against other players who are about as good as you. And if you keep beating them, you get matched up against harder and harder people. And I think that that solves the 50% win rate problem that deck-based matchmaking would solve. I don't know what upside they would get from deck-based matchmaking that isn't already built in to a normal skill-based matchmaking system. The deck-based matchmaking people are like, oh, well, they just don't want you to have too many wins in a row. And it's like, that will happen if you just have normal matchmaking. You can have like an outlier amount of coin flip wins, but you will even out. That's how it works. So, like, I just don't understand what the point of it is. Also, something I've noticed, and this is really interesting to me, it's always counter decks. It's not decks that beat me. It's counter decks. Like, if you think this is happening, I'm kind of interested in you keeping track of what the cards are that you're worried about. Because I think a lot of this is like, I played Mr. Negative, and then someone played a Mobius on me. And nobody in my last 10 games had played a Mobius. And it's like, yeah, because if I have the choice between playing a Mobius on turn 3 and playing my copycat on turn 3, I'm always going to take the copycat if you're not playing Mr. Negative or some other deck where Mobius is actually good. He's just going to sit in my hand. That's what he's for, right? And I think there's kind of a lot of that with tech cards. It's interesting to me that every time people talk about deck-based matchmaking, they talk about tech cards and specific answers rather than counters in the way that someone at the high level of the game would talk about them, which is like, I'm playing mid-range and I got matched up against Cerebro, right? Like, that kind of stuff is really, really prominent, right? Like, that is how it would work if the system actually existed. It's always counters. And I think that that is indicative to me of what's actually happening here, which is people are noticing the counters when they play decks that the counters are good against, and the counters are just sitting in people's hands when they play decks that the counters aren't good against. It is notable to me how this is always about counters, answers, things that are understated and you don't play unless they're doing something, than it is about just bad matchups. It's always, they had the Shang-Chi for my 10s deck, and never, I ran into a matchup where they simply were playing the same mid-range deck as me with more points. I also don't necessarily blame the community for being like this in this way. Like, I think it's a wrong belief, but I think that Second Dinner's history with the bots and things like that on ladder, it makes it very easy for you to believe things that aren't true about them, I think. So my argument for why this isn't happening is that they don't need it to happen in order to have a good matchmaking system that drags you to a 50% win rate. It would be really hard to make happen, and kind of totally pointless to do that if you already have a 50% win rate. And largely, I think most reportings of something like this happening are based on people running into tech cards when they finally play a deck the tech card is vulnerable to, i.e. observational bias, rather than something real. The balancing team needs more testing or more people. The way they nerf cards and never revisit them is insane. Nocturne still hasn't gotten her power back. White Widow has been dead for a year. Spider-Man 2099 is still unplayable. I think that there's this idea that, like, when card is good, that means balance is good, right? Like, that's sort of the underlying thing here, is like, they nerfed these cards and it's bad that they're bad. But sometimes it's not bad that a card is bad. Sometimes it's actually good that a card is bad, or it's the desired state of affairs that a card be bad. Nocturne is a great example of this. Nocturne at 3/5 was a slap into every single deck. It was a location changer that went in everything everyone was doing that did points at the time, that also moved. This was a card that had probably one or too many lines of text, and definitely 1 point too many. But the effect that it had was to amplify two things. The first is it amplified the amount the average deck was lying about where its power went on turn 6. And the second is it amplified the amount that a good player could play around bad locations. And both of those things drastically impact the skill curve of the whole game. A better player is going to be able to use Nocturne to obviate much of the negative RNG built into Marvel Snap. In much the same way as when you had these sort of Stardust, Mobius, Mercury decks, you basically had a bunch of locations that naturally went in your favor because of how much ground they covered. Nocturne was that, but in one card. And that is such a dangerous card to make. A card that takes the skill curve of your game and flattens it, or I guess what's the opposite of flatten? Heightens it? The better player wins even more when Nocturne is involved. And I personally believe that the thing that keeps card games good is that there is an amount of randomness involved where the worst player beats the better player a decent number of the time. That is important to card games, and Nocturne was a direct offender at that. Another direct offender that currently exists is Merlin, but Merlin doesn't do that to the level Nocturne did, because he asks so much of you in deck building that it's kind of a little bit harder to get him into decks. He's more of an archetype-specific card, even though he's probably the archetype-defining card. He's still an archetype, yeah? Nocturne was just in everything, lying about every turn 6. Locations that were ostensibly bad for your deck weren't bad for your deck anymore. Just a very frustrating and annoying thing to happen. So when you say Nocturne hasn't gotten their power back, that's them being smart. That's not them being stupid. White Widow is another great example of this. White Widow sucks. It's a terrible card to have good. Do I think maybe they overdid it? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think they shouldn't have released White Widow in the first place. When that card was good, it was deeply unfun. It was deeply annoying. A clog card with no potential downside attached that just randomly was also a 2/6. A fairly ridiculous card to ever really exist. oh, look, it's a 2/6 for a priority, and then you play like a Negasonic in that lane, and it's a 2/6 in actuality. The card was messed up. Could they have made it weaker and made it not an important piece of those decks? I don't think they could have, because as long as it is a 2-cost clog card with no downside, it's kind of going to be the GOAT, right? Like, it's just going to be really, really good. Do you want clog to be good? No? Well, then don't buff White Widow. White Widow's a great argument for like a full rework, but I think you haven't fully reworked White Widow is a very different critique to you should have buffed White Widow. Don't buff White Widow. That's ridiculous. That's not a card people want to play against. The last card is Spider-Man 2099, which I think is arguably a failure on their part. I think there's a reasonable world in which you could say Spider-Man 2099, that one probably should have been made better. But how? How do you propose it was better? Because they had it at 4 cost for a while. It wasn't very good. And they brought it to 5 and it's not very good. So if you bring it to 3, well, what you're doing is you're taking what is already, for the last year, basically, been one of the best decks in the game, which is Move. And you're giving it another really good thing to do with 3. Like, why would we do that? Why is that a thing that we want in our game? I don't know. That's definitely the kind of thing that sticks out to me about this. It's like that balance is not when cards strong. Sometimes in order to do balance properly, you need to say it doesn't make the game better to have these cards be good. If you don't have the latest release cards, you're screwed. The ability of the Marvel Snap community to hold these sort of like diametrically opposed views, like we started this video off with a comment about how bad buying the new cards would be for you. Like, this archetype is dead, and now we're here. This game is pay to win. If you don't have the latest cards, you're screwed. It's just not true. Like, I think that you could probably put together a reasonable to good Cerebro 3 deck for free and beat everyone all the way up to, like, top 50. If you were a good player, I think you could probably do that pretty reasonably. Like, it's an extremely possible thing to do. I strongly suspect that that is a very reasonable and functional thing you can do with... I'm building it in my head right now. I don't know if it could be all Series 3, but a lot Series 3. And you just like use whatever your tokens are on like whatever supplementary things that you want in there. I strongly suspect that you can do that. I strongly suspect that you've been able to do that ever since they buffed Cerebro to 3. I think that what Marvel Snap is not a game that requires you to have all of these cards in order to win. It is a game that, and that, for the record, is probably the best argument to not nerf Cerebro. I want to be clear about that. It's probably the best argument to not nerf Cerebro is that it's a really strong deck that an early game player can access. It's sort of the same space Hella was in, where it's a little iffy. But if you want to play like me, Mr. Mid-Range Pile, well then yeah, you kind of do need a lot of the new cards. Because when you play mid-range pile decks, a lot of what you're doing is picking and choosing the absolute apex stat cards, the best cards you can do to get the most stats out of them for the least investment, and then the rest of your deck is tech. That matters when you want to play like that. But I think there are a fair few combo style decks that are honestly a lot better than you think they are right now. Like anything that is reasonably dodging a Cosmic Ghost Rider, I think is in a really good spot right now and probably very, very strong. And you can absolutely get those decks without having any of the new cards in them. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one.